This might be one of the most important videos I make, as well as a warning to all. I've spoke a lot about the 3 tiers of men in my previous videos. Sub 5 unattractive guys who struggle massively in the dating market. Normie tier average men who have a mediocre dating life but are at least getting noticed occasionally. Then chads who are living their dating lives as if it's a walk in the park. Anyway, the purpose of this video is to provide as much evidence and reasoning to show the gaps between these 3 tiers of men are all growing at an alarming rate, particularly in between normies and chads. At no other point in history have the guys at the top 10 to 15%, had such a powerful monopoly over the dating market. Anyway, let's get this started and we'll begin with some scientific data. First, let's take a look at this Finnish study, which tracks the median number of intimate partners for men on the left and women on the right. And the different lines on the chart show us how trends have changed for each age group between 1971 to 2015, a time frame spanning just under 50 years. Anyway, hopefully you understand the data. Well done if you do, but if you don't, then don't worry, because the main part I'm going to be focusing on is just the 18 to 24 age group, the youngest generation. If we pay attention to only the most recent data, the 2015 chart, we see the average 18 to 24-year-old man has had just 3 partners, which is in fact the lowest reading since they started collecting data. Meanwhile, for 18 to 24-year-old women, theirs is at an all-time high of 5, almost twice as high as the guys. Now, despite initial instinct thinking this is impossible if there are equal numbers of men and women, in actual fact this can be possible for a few reasons. Here's 3 potential reasons why there may be this disparity, but not all of them are true. 1. Younger women are choosing to date guys in older age groups, which is leaving the men in their own age group left out. 2. Either men are downplaying or women are upplaying the number of partners they've had. In other words, either group is lying about their partners. And 3. Bearing in mind this data only looks at the median, meaning middle person, it is possible there are just a few guys at the top racking up ridiculously high body counts. Then this also has an impact on the wider dating pool as it drives up the average woman's partner count. Anyway, the disparity could potentially be explained by any one of these 3 reasons, but I think the most likely is this last one here. Firstly, I doubt the first reason has much of an impact because the average age gap of Western couples tends to be quite low anyway. This data shows the average age gap by country. In the West, the age gap hovers roughly around 2 years worth of difference. Secondly, for this point about lying, if anything, the data would be skewed in the opposite direction. It is usually men who exaggerate the number of partners they've had, meanwhile women tend to downplay the number. Therefore, I think it's safe to say the disparity seen of average women having more partners than average men is being driven mainly by a few guys at the top monopolizing over the dating market and seeing multiple women at one time. Anyway, so right now we know there is a gap. But how do we know if it's growing or not? Well, if we bring back the data to look at how things were 50 years ago, we'll be able to compare it with today and see how things have changed since then. And what's surprising is back in the 1970s, the way things were was the polar opposite of the way things are today. Back then, it was men who had a higher number of median partners, and women had lower. This implies there were a small minority of women increasing the partner count of lots of different guys up and down the scale. And I think it's also implied that this minority of promiscuous women weren't necessarily the highest value. It's common knowledge that a woman's ability to be promiscuous isn't limited by her attractiveness at all. In fact, a bottom 10% woman will have an easier time finding short-term partners than a top 20% man. A woman's promiscuity is correlated to her values, while a man's promiscuity is correlated to his value. Anyway, back to the point. The 70s data shows there was less of a gap compared to what we have today. Back then, there were more guys in with a chance. So this change shows a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the dating market over the last 50 years. To show one more piece of supporting evidence before moving on to the reasons for why this gap is growing is this chart, which measures the percentage of men and women that have had no intimacy in the last year. And again, as you can see, here is more evidence that the men at the bottom are suffering more than ever. There is a sharp rise since the turn of the 2010s, showing an increase in the number of guys who don't have access to intimacy. And coincidentally, this lines up perfectly with the founding of Tinder and explosion of other online dating apps. On the flip side, when you look at the rates for women, surprise surprise, it has remained more or less flat, which, as touched upon earlier, is unlikely to be correlated to a lack of attractiveness. Because as established, even if a woman is unattractive, if she wanted to, she could still easily meet dozens of guys simply by putting herself out there. So to make things clear, it's implied by the data the 10 to 20% of women making up this figure are almost undoubtedly there by choice, not by impotence. Anyway, now onto the reasons for why this gap is growing. There are 5 in total I've identified. But before I do that, if you've enjoyed the diagnosis part of the video, now is a good time to press the like button and leave any thoughts you have in the comments below so far, as it helps the YouTube algorithm. Number 1. Chad monopolization. Generally speaking, times of abundance leads to less equality. Because what usually ends up happening is a few top percentage individuals capitalize on the abundance of opportunities before other people get a chance. Relating this to the dating market, in this period of humanity, we now have both more free time and wider social circles than ever. We also have access to online dating, which puts you within reaching distance of thousands of new women that before you never would have interacted with. So on the surface, these things sound like fantastic news if you're a guy looking for a smooth sailing dating life. But in reality, this is terrible news for anyone outside of the top 20%. Because quite obviously, you're not the only one with a greater opportunity in dating. What's happening nowadays is the top guys are able to date as many women as they want, as long as they have enough hours in the day, days in the week, and swipes on Tinder to do so. Whereas before, even if a top percentage guy wanted to date lots of women, it simply was not possible due to other time commitments and inaccessibility. What makes this point worse still is that the dating market is a zero-sum game. Meaning, when one guy dates several women and takes them out of the market, those are options that are lost for you. Anyway, that's the first reason. However, this point wouldn't be applicable if it weren't for this second reason, which is the fact that men have a biological drive to divide and conquer. If a man is given the opportunity to capitalize, he will do it every single time. Men are biologically driven to spread their seed as far as possible, because this gives them the highest possible chance of passing on their genes. Meanwhile, women can't afford to do this. Their focus is on quality rather than quantity. There's a few reasons for this, namely the fact that a woman can only produce 1 child every 9 months, meanwhile a man could in theory produce around 250 to 300 in that time. A woman is also more invested in the raising and nurturing of her child. She's the one that actually has to go through childbirth and raise it for 10 to 20 years. And yes, although these things are made easier if there's a man in the picture, it's not an absolute necessity, and he has the option to scarper at any second. Now moving on to reason 3. The bar set for men is being raised higher and higher every year. As the collective standards that women hold rise, this means more and more guys are getting priced out of the market. How do we know the bar is rising? To give some quick examples, 100 years ago, you'd had to have literally been a genetic anomaly to be over 6 foot in height. Before the turn of the 20th century, the average man was under 170 centimeters. So there were more guys below 5'7" than above. But funnily enough, nowadays, 6 foot is seen as the norm, and if you're below this height, it's perceived as a strike against you. Another example, throughout the 1900s, if you were one of the few people that owned a car, that would have given you a massive amount of credit and increased your status. But now, Owning a car is more or less an expectation of modern life. Never forget this quote, guys. In the dating market, the desires of today are to become the expectations of tomorrow. Again, the desires of today are to become the expectations of tomorrow. I recently saw a Reddit post that said 250k is the new six figures. Technology is also causing expectations to rise. Women are so accustomed to seeing model tier men on Instagram and TikTok that when they see guys in real life who are actually fairly average, they mistake them as being way beneath that. Anyway, now moving on to reason 4, which may actually be the most important factor, and that is birth control. See, previously, in fact, throughout all of human history, even if a woman wanted to be promiscuous and sleep with the men at the top, it came with a massive risk, because if she got pregnant without a provider in place, then she's going to have an incredibly difficult time raising her child with proper nurture and care. But nowadays, since birth control has came in the picture, it's opened the floodgate so women can more or less be as promiscuous as they want with minimal risks involved. In fact, the only things to be worried about today is infections and any potential social repercussions. But I still think these two things are nothing in comparison to the risk of having a child, which requires constant attention and resources for a minimum of 10 years. Finally, reason number 5. Nowadays, looks is everything. Bringing back the chart about average age gaps, it's interesting to see the more developed countries have much smaller age differences. I believe the main reason attributing to this is because in poorer nations, women have a much greater priority of seeking wealth and resources when it comes to mate selection. Why is this relevant? Well, quite obviously, the older you are, the more time you've had to climb the workplace ladder, accrue wealth, pay off debt, etc. In the US, the average 35 to 44-year-old has 6 times the net worth of the average person under 35. However, with regard to appearance, it's clear going for older, wealthy guys comes with a trade-off in the looks department. Therefore, if a woman desires wealth, she is more likely to pursue guys in their mid to late 30s with careers and assets. Meanwhile, if she wants a guy who's attractive, she's more likely to pursue guys in their 20s. Anyway, the point is, in many parts of the West, chasing older guys for wealth just isn't relevant anymore. In poorer nations, it is relevant because a young woman finding an older wealthy man can pave a path out of poverty for her. But in the West, the majority of individuals aren't impoverished, so women can afford to push to one side chasing men with wealth, which then opens space for being more focused on younger guys they actually find attractive. Anyway, to tie this back to the original topic, this point as a whole has led to a wider division between average and attractive guys, because before modernisation, average men could at least still be somewhat competitive by utilising their 20s building wealth, so they'll later have something to provide in their 30s. But today, this is getting to the point of being all but redundant, and in its place is a greater emphasis on the importance of looks. Anyway, those are my reasons for why the gaps are increasing. If you want to see where you yourself stand in the current dating market with regards to looks, then be sure to get a personal face rating from me on my Fiverr page. The prices are as follows, and a link will be the first in the description below. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you press the like button and leave any thoughts you have in the comments below, as it helps the YouTube algorithm.